Good evening and welcome to this special Ask the Expert session on independent taxation. The States Assembly agreed the first law changes on the 15th of September this year, and the first group of islanders will move to independent taxation from the 1st of January 2022. This is your chance to ask questions about what is changing, why, how the changes will be made, who they impact, and what you may need to do to prepare. We're here in the Government of Jersey studio in St Helier. I'm Malcolm Ferry, CEO for Headway Jersey and former CEO of Citizens Advice, and I'm your host for this evening. Revenue Jersey launched public communications about the move to independent taxation in September. There's been leaflets sent to every household, information on the website, and a new tax calculator and public briefing events across the island in October. To round up these events, we're bringing discussions online this evening. We're here for the next hour, and you have the opportunity to ask questions about what you've read and heard. Our panel, starting to my immediate right, we have Deputy Susie Pennell, Treasury Minister. Good evening, Susie.
Good evening, Malcolm.
And here also, Controller for Revenue, Richard Summersgill. Good evening, Richard.
Good evening, Malcolm.
We have the Deputy Director for Domestic Tax Policy, Fiona Fraser. Good evening, Fiona.
Good evening, Malcolm.
And Operations Manager for Personal Customers, Christophe Aitelage. Good evening, Christophe.
Good evening, Malcolm.
Now, don't forget, this is your opportunity to ask questions, and you can do this via the slido.com app. All you need to do is go to your browser, put in slido.com, and then put in the hashtag taxexperts. If you see a question there that you like, you can click like on that question. It'll come to the top, and it's more likely that we'll be able to get that question in front of the panel this evening. So get onto Slido and get your questions in there, and we'll be able to ask them. Now, before we start with your questions, let's warm up our panel members. So, Minister, you're approaching the end of your first term as Minister for Treasury and Resources, and you previously served as Minister for Social Security. Two big jobs there. You said in your opening speech for the debate on independent taxation legislation, and if I can quote your words, I cannot understand the real difficulties posed by the move to independent taxation when the starting point is a system in which wives and partners are all but invisible. Can you explain a little bit more about exactly what you meant by that?
Well, this tax law, as it currently stands, was formed in 1928, which pretty much explains it all, really, in a tax law that's nearly 100 years old. Where women were deemed to be chattels of their husband, which is pretty unacceptable. And we need to modernise the tax law now, and it has to be equal, transparent, and the equality is not just so much in the relationship, but also in the gender, which we have to also recognise. So it's well past its time to be changed, modernised. It's difficult, which is probably why nobody's tackled it before, quite complicated. And our move from prior year basis tax to current year basis tax had to be done before we introduce the independent taxation. But it will go forward over a few years. It's not going to be done overnight, and so that people won't be disadvantaged by it and will have time to get used to it. But it's mainly the modernisation and the equality.
Yeah. Okay. So I think that's come through quite strongly. So is this move as much about equality as it is about anything else?
Well, yes, it's also very difficult to run a dual tax system. And so the idea is to get everybody onto the same independent taxation, whatever their status, relationship, and whatever they earn, which will, I think, Controller will come up with the allowances that are allowed to compensate for any losses.
Okay, thank you, Susie. And that leads us on nicely to Richard. So moving to you, Controller, you're responsible for all aspects of administering the tax system and collection of tax. And you've worked with the Minister and with the Treasurer in developing these changes. We understand from the Minister that change was needed, particularly for those new to the island perhaps who may not know. How did you reach the decision that this system and the way we're delivering it is the right way to go?
Well, it's involved a great deal of engagement with people across the island, really very actively over the last 4 years. We've had quite significant consultation exercises through social media, outbound telephone campaigns to canvass opinions, focus groups, and so on. And over the last 4 years, we reckon that about 5,000 people have engaged with the work and the consultation, which is probably one of the best responses to a government engagement exercise. Islanders were asked to consider a number of options. The basic two options were to keep the current form of married people's taxation, but in a modernised form, ideally, or to move to a form of independent taxation, which is what most Western jurisdictions do in this day and age. Most countries have moved to that sort of scheme. And really, the majority of people right throughout have told us that the equality and fairness that independent taxation will bring is what's most important to them in this day and age. So the great challenge, as the Minister has said, has been making sure we do this in a way that does allow people who would otherwise be financially disadvantaged from it to have a very gentle landing into independent taxation.
Okay, thank you. I mean, 5,000 is a fantastic response to any consultation. Do you think that's because tax is probably one of the things that affects almost everybody?
I think it is, but I don't think we should underestimate how many people do find the current form of taxation offensive. Particularly people coming to the island from jurisdictions where they were taxed in their own right. And that's not just women. We do have civil partnership, and for the last few years, same-sex marriages. And some of the tax law that has been fitted to that is really quite offensive. So, for example, if you're in a same-sex marriage, the older person takes the place of the man and the younger person the place of the woman. So there are an awful lot of people out there who find our current system of taxation really quite offensive.
Thank you, Richard. I'm sure we'll explore that a bit further as the hour goes on. So Fiona, if I can move to you now. In your role as Deputy Director for Tax and Policy, you've worked with Revenue Policy Development Board and Revenue Jersey's Customer Communications and other experts on the project to help ensure that the laws that are put in place are practically and efficient and in the fairest way for all islanders. Can you talk us through, in simple terms, what this law will be changing for islanders and when, and what they really need to know?
I'll try to keep it simple, Malcolm. There are 3 stages. The first stage, as you've already heard, is from the 1st of January next year, the 2022 tax year. And all islanders who are single and all new arrivals to the island, whether they're single or married, will move to independent taxation. Single people will stay taxed independently, new arrivals will be taxed independently regardless of their status. Stage 2 is an optional phase, and that will begin from 2023. Married couples and civil partners, as at the end of this year, if somebody's married or in a civil partnership at the end of this year, they will be able to opt next year between January and July to move the following year. So that's stage 2, and it's optional, it's not mandatory. And at the same time, next year, we'll be asking the States Assembly to debate and pass some more legislation to make sure that we can bring in the final stage of independent taxation. So stage 3 is going to happen if the states pass that legislation that I've just mentioned. That will be by 2025, and it will be mandatory. So all remaining couples in marriages or civil partners will be moved to independent taxation at that time. And at the same time, we'll be introducing a contributory allowance, which will allow compensatory allowance, my apologies, which will allow taxpayers who would otherwise lose out financially if they're marginal rate taxpayers. It will compensate them for the financial impact of moving to independent taxation. Okay. So that's the stages. And how will islanders know if it affects them? Well, if you're single, you are already independently taxed. You will see no change at all. Even if you get married or enter into a civil partnership after the end of this year, you will stay being taxed as you are. If you're cohabiting with somebody, sometimes called common law husband and wife, in tax law you are still single. So you will remain taxed the same way you are now. You'll see no change at all. The change, the biggest change will be to those islanders who are married or in a civil partnership at the end of this year, and who access allowances as part of calculating their tax liability. And that's around 9 in 10 islanders. So that group will see a change in the allowances that are applicable to them under independent taxation. So it's very important that that group understand what the changes are and how it will affect them.
Okay, thank you. So, moving on to Christoph then. As operations manager for personal customers, you oversee all aspects of work involved with assessing and collecting personal tax. And you've worked with the project team to plan these changes to your processes. What are customers are going to experience and the support that they will get as they go through the next few years? So can you explain simply how these allowances that Fiona refers to will change and why there's a need for what you're calling the compensatory allowance?
Right, yes, Malcolm, I'll keep it as simple as I can, and I'll carry on what my co-presenters have said. It's worth knowing that for the vast majority of taxpayers, nothing will change. You won't end up having a higher tax bill just because we've moved into independent taxation. And I'll give you an example. Under the current regime, if you're married or in a civil partnership, you do benefit as a couple. You do benefit of £25,700 of married couples allowance, to which we would add £6,300 of second earners allowance. So in the example we've got now, if a partner A earns £40,000 and a partner B earns £30,000, you have a combined income of £70,000 for the couple, to which we will deduct the £32,000 made of the married couples allowance and the second earner. You end up with a taxable income of £38,000. Now you can see on the example, it doesn't change when we move to independent taxation, because what we're proposing to do is that both units in a couple will benefit from the £16,000 of allowance, bringing it to £32,000. Now, Fiona and the Minister were mentioning about the compensatory allowance. This is only applicable to those couples where one doesn't earn £16,000. So you can see that if you don't earn that amount, you will not benefit from the full allowance. So what we are proposing to do is to introduce a compensatory allowance. That means that we will top up your allowance in a way, if I may say, in order to end up that you don't end up paying more taxes.
Thank you. So this is a reminder to get your questions in on slido.com. Go to your web browser, put in slido.com. We've already had loads of questions coming in, but you can ask your own question, or you can like a question, which will bring it to the top of the list, and we're far more likely to put that question before the panel this evening. So let's kick off straight away, and if I can just put this question to the whole panel. Compensatory allowance, this is not good enough. 10 years then to be reviewed. It is not fair taxing the families more for staying at home looking after children. How does the panel respond to that? Who'd like to go first?
Well, I'm happy to kick off on that. I think, as has been said already, the vast majority of married people will not be worse off in independent taxation. Over 14,000 married people will either be better off or no worse off. There are about 7,000 married people who we think would be worse off in independent taxation if we gave them no help. And the Minister has committed to help those people. She made that commitment 2 years ago, and that is the work we have done to develop the compensatory allowance. Now, what that allowance will do for at least 10 years from the point at which independent taxation becomes mandatory, so potentially 14 years from now, there will be an allowance which makes sure those 7,000 or so married people are no worse off. Over that time, we expect inflation and the way that we normally operate tax allowances will very gently land those people fully into independent taxation. However, that very much does depend on how inflation operates over the next 10 years. So what the Minister has proposed is that in about, say, 7 or 8 years' time, the States Assembly will be asked to revise the compensatory allowance, to look at it and see if it needs to continue beyond 10 years. And if the states members of the day decide it does, then it would continue for a longer period of time. But essentially, the compensatory allowance effectively perpetuates the unfairness that exists in the tax system now. It's giving people who were married up until 31st of December this year a financial advantage over everybody else in society. So over time, in order to deliver the policy outcome of fairness and equality, the compensatory allowance would erode until everyone very gently lands in independent taxation.
So do you think, Richard, that, or maybe this is a question for Susie off the back of that, do you think that that decision in 7 years' time will be made on the basis of the state of our finances, our public finances, or will it be made in the case of providing this greater equality?
I think it's a combination of several things, because, as Richard said, it would be where inflation is. I mean, that's dropped hugely in the last couple of years, obviously, so it will probably start going up again. So it really is what it says on the tin. It's a compensatory allowance to make sure that people do not then end up paying more taxes because of it. And if a review is done in 7 or 8 years and it's decided by the then government, with Revenue Jersey, that it should take longer, then it can take longer. The 10 years is not set in stone.
Okay, that's good to know. Does any other members of the panel have anything to add onto that one? No?
I wonder whether it's worth reminding people, Malcolm, that at the moment there are, with that question, the second part of that question, parents who are unmarried where one parent stays at home and they currently don't receive any personal allowance.
A really good point, actually, Fiona. Yeah, thank you. So, another question that's come in and got lots of likes. How mortgage and children allowance will be split between the couples? Does that kind of, yeah, Christoph, you're nodding there. That's this is your domain.
I'm happy to take this one.
Yeah, go ahead.
The children allowance, as it stands at the moment, you can decide to apportion them any way you like. It can be 50-50, it can be 100% one side, 0% the other side. You can do 75-25. We will keep that going. We will do it in any way the couple wishes to do. By default, with independent taxation, and people will see that if they go on a calculator we have put online, the calculator splits 50-50. However, it doesn't mean it has to be that way. Now, going to the mortgage allowance, the mortgage relief, it's worth reminding that the allowance is only payable to the person who has made the payment. So you can't claim a relief on a payment you haven't made. And it's the same way here. If you pay your mortgage as a couple, you may want to split the mortgage payment in half, and both sides of the couple claim their relief.
Okay, perfect. Do any of the other panel members have anything to add to those points? No? Okay. Okay, thank you. So here's one kind of off the back of what I was just talking about, the state of our public finances. I've heard that independent taxation will cost about £4 million in lost revenue and that high earners will pay less. Is this true or is this a myth?
The cost of the 4 million relates to the taxes claimed from couples currently taxed at the standard rate of 20%, which won't make any difference to high value earners who will be taxed at 20% as well.
Okay, Richard?
I mean it is true that independent taxation will actually cost the government money. Contrary to the other question that I think has been asked, that isn't this a stealthy way of collecting more taxes?
Yeah.
It's certainly not a stealthy way of collecting more taxes. There is a cost to moving to independent taxation, and that is because some higher earners, when they are taxed independently, one spouse will benefit from tax allowances, whereas at the moment they don't benefit from tax allowances.
Yeah.
So, for if you have one spouse who maybe earns 70 or 80,000, and then one spouse who earns 25,000, at the moment the married couple would get no tax allowances, but in independent taxation the spouse on the lower income would be entitled to allowances. That is an inevitable consequence of independent taxation.
And actually then to flesh that out a bit, Richard, one of the questions asks, families that have one parent working part-time and one full-time will be penalised by not allowing the tax allowance to be shared after the initial period expires. Can you talk a bit more to what you were saying there?
Well, Fiona may want to come in on this, but it does very much depend on the circumstances of the two spouses and exactly how much each of them earns.
Of course.
And the compensatory allowance is indeed designed to mitigate where a couple might find themselves with less money in their pocket because of the move to independent taxation. So as we say, the whole idea of the compensatory allowance is that over a long period of time it very gently lands people into independent taxation.
Okay. So Fiona, do you have anything to add to that point?
I think this question as well is helpful because some islanders, I think, they look at their allowances as shared in a marriage, say, or a civil partnership, because they're treated as a unit for tax purposes.
Yep.
So in that sense, they both have access to the allowance that's allocated to the married couple or the civil partnership.
Yep.
But under independent taxation, each will be taxed separately and each will have their own allowance. And as I think we've all had a chance to mention, the compensatory allowance is designed to ensure that where a lower earning spouse can't make full use of their own personal allowance and they will otherwise be worse off than they are when they're taxed as a unit with their spouse or civil partner, that allowance will make sure that they're no worse off financially, that couple.
Excellent. So don't forget, get your questions in on slido.com using the hashtag taxexperts. We've got more and more coming in. If you see a question that you like, you can just like it if you don't want to ask the question yourself. It can be anonymous if you like, or you can tag your name to it. So let's just get back to some more questions on Slido. Can I ask if people are compensated should they fall under the scope of extra tax from these changes? Then what is the point of changing the system at all?
Well, I think the policy objectives of moving to independent taxation are, as the Minister has described them, they're all about fairness and equity. There is a very strong argument, actually, that our current tax system may be contrary to various international human rights treaties in the way it does treat women. Mm-hmm. So it is a change that probably was inevitable. And is a facet of a modern society. As I said, the fact that some couples might financially benefit from independent taxation is an inevitable consequence of moving to independent taxation. I think the questioner is suggesting maybe those couples perhaps ought to be taxed additionally in some way to recover that additional benefit. I think that was actually a point raised in discussion with the scrutiny panel with the Minister. It's a point of view. Clearly, everyone has very strong views about taxation in Jersey, as you said earlier, Malcolm. So, you know, it's there are always issues relating to that. The cost of £4 million, which we've identified, the Minister has said she doesn't feel we need to worry too much at this stage about how to recover those or whether to recover them, because the public finances are actually in not bad shape given everything that has hit the island over the last 2 years.
That's excellent. Have you got anything to add to that, Minister?
No, but the question, what's the point in changing the system at all? I think we've gone through at length, so it needs to be changed. We must get on with it, and as long as nobody is worse off, then we can move forward.
Okay, thank you. Here's one about the public hearings, which might be for Christoph. Why were 4 out of the 5 public briefings done during the working day when the public cannot attend due to work and childcare problems?
Thank you for the question, Malcolm. The question rightly says 4 out of 5 were done during the day, which means one was done in the evening. And I might add that the one we are currently doing now is also outside of hours. So it's always very difficult to strike the right balance to try to catch as many people as you can, if you like. What we have also ensured is that we have put out there as much information as we can for those people that couldn't come either to the events, and we have also made sure that some information is available in forms of printouts of the website for those people that don't access the online or don't have internet.
Okay, thank you. Does anyone have anything to add to that?
If I may, just build on Christoph's point. He's quite right that there are hard copy information available at parish halls, the library, and citizens' advice. And again, gov.je, the website, if you do have access to the website, there's more and more information there about these changes, and you can also find the tax calculator.
Excellent. Do you want to just tell us a little bit more about that tax calculator, Fiona?
It's been developed not just for this project, but because we do understand that people do find tax complicated and they do find it difficult. So the tax calculator is now available online, and the whole principle is you can put in basic details about salary, about allowances, about things that you might be able to get relief from tax for. Nothing to do with independent taxation. You can just go online and put your details in, put the details of your spouse or partner, and then you can look at what the tax position would be broadly under the current system and whether it would change under independent taxation. And the idea there is to give people the opportunity to play around with the figures, to think if they know that the circumstances are going to change in the next few years, if they know perhaps they're going to start a family or they're going to retire, they can put different figures in to try and work out whether it's better for them potentially to elect to move, to opt to move more quickly, or to stay where they are and wait for the compensatory allowance. So it's a really good, neat tool. We've had a lot of very positive feedback, and we're continuing to develop it.
Brilliant. And actually, off the back of that, there's a question that asks, my husband is on a state's pension and I earn £5,000. We opt to have separate tax bills and now or wait, and if so, why have to pay more tax? Sorry, that just skipped off my screen as I was reading it. Did you manage to get that? Yeah, if you go ahead.
That, yes. If I understand well the question, okay, that's the one on top here. Right.
Yeah,
My husband, I earn 50,000. Should we opt in? I can't advise anybody to opt in or opt out because it's a legal declaration, if you like. So and that's the reason why we've put so much information out there and a tax calculator, so that the onus is on everybody as individuals to understand potentially the consequences of moving into independent taxation and to make their own choice. Now, what I can say is nobody will be paying more tax when we move into independent taxation from 2025, by 2025. Now, if somebody decides today that they want to be independently taxed from 2023, I would urge caution. I would ask them to do their research and understand what their tax position will be from 2023, because there will not be an allowance from there. It will only be available by 2025.
Of course. Okay. No, thank you for that fulsome answer. There's another one coming. This might be for you, Susie. There's an election next year, as you know. What if new politicians don't deliver on independent tax, and if there isn't a compensatory allowance? Because that hasn't been decided yet, has it? Will it be an election issue?
I don't think it will, because there is an overwhelming majority in the debate in September about bringing in independent taxation. So I don't think that side of it will be reversed. And I don't think any new Assembly is likely to remove a compensatory allowance that will be to the detriment of a few people. So I don't think that's likely to happen at all. But as we said earlier, that the 10-year scheme could be extended after 7 years. 7 or 8 years. Yeah. So I don't think any Assembly is likely to remove that.
No. It'll be interesting. Maybe we'll have to watch manifestos to see if anyone mentions it when they're in their pitch. Does anyone have anything else to add to that point? No, okay, thank you. Let's have a look. So don't forget, get your questions in on slido.com using the hashtag #taxexperts. If you see a question that you like, you can like it, it'll come to the top. Or if you want to ask a question yourself, you can do it completely anonymously if you like. Another one that's come in: how does childcare or mortgage allowance be calculated in the independent taxation for married couples?
This one, Malcolm. I suspect the question is about childcare tax relief and mortgage relief as well. So, as I explained slightly earlier, it's the person who pays claims for the relief. So there's not going to be any change there as far as we're concerned.
Okay, thank you. So someone else asks, allowances for children, how will these work, and with both parents working but one parent on a very low income, less than 15,000 and another on a high income? And again, we did touch on that, but perhaps we could answer that person's question again with that specific £15,000 threshold.
Yes. If somebody earns £15,000, they will not be liable to tax, which means they have no use of the child allowance, which means by deduction they can then relinquish that child allowance to the other part of the couple. So nothing is lost here. And I might even say if somebody earns £15,000, they will be able to, as a couple, to claim £1,000 worth of compensatory allowance.
Okay, thank you. Very simple one. Why are pensions taxed?
Well, this is a question that comes up a lot. Pensions are income, basically, and are subject to income tax. All pensions. If the question is raising the issue of the state's old age pension, then there have been a couple of petitions over the last 2 or 3 years lobbying the State's Assembly to make those tax-free. The reality is, of course, that if a person is on a full state's old age pension, they will not be paying tax because it's below the taxable thresholds. Our tax thresholds in Jersey are relatively high compared to the other Crown dependencies in the UK. So a state's old age pension alone would not render a pensioner liable to income tax. If, however, in addition to a state's old age pension, a couple had other pensions, private pensions, then they are more likely to pay tax.
Okay, thank you. So here's a question about the customer experience, Christoph. Will you have resources to cope with the changes as they happen, as you have more work to deal with at present than you appear to be understaffed? Is the department currently under pressure, and what's that going to look like in the future?
Right. To answer the first part of the question, yes, the department is under pressure, but I must say, and I'm unbiased, you will say, we are coping well, given the circumstances. The reason why we're approaching independent taxation in phases is exactly for that point. You wouldn't move all islanders into independent taxation from one day to another, because that would be a recipe for disaster, if you like. So that's the reason why, as Fiona explained earlier, we have 3 stages that would allow the Revenue Jersey to deal with those stages as they come along.
Yeah, okay. And do you want to add to that, Richard? What's the morale like with staff at the moment?
Morale is actually good in Revenue Jersey. There's a great deal of camaraderie. It's undoubtedly been a challenging few years. In 2019, we brought in new computer systems, and we've been making a lot of changes to the way we do things, and that slowed us down. And then COVID, of course, came along and pretty much doubled our workloads. We spent a lot of time helping businesses and individual taxpayers with the financial distress of lockdown. So we did accumulate some quite large backlogs during 2020. The Minister has very kindly given us additional resources, which we've recruited new people. We are getting on top of those backlogs. Our customer service is improving. But we are still in a state of transition. The Jersey's tax system was very manual and heavily paper-based, and gradually, as we move to more digital solutions and online filing, customer service is improving greatly.
Good. And Minister, presumably you go into the department periodically, in fact probably on a daily basis. How do you find the atmosphere when you go in?
Hardly daily, but yes. And we have constant meetings with the tax team to find out, because as they've said that they were under a huge amount of pressure. I mean, they moved from Cyril and Markle House up to Lamott Street, which was the first thing, then changed an antiquated computer system, and all had to get used to that. And as Richard said, the online filing system has helped considerably, whereas it was very paper-orientated before. And in a sort of double-edged sword, because some of the people leaving finance have come to tax, which has meant that they're pretty well trained in finance and tax. So we haven't had to go through the massive training programs that we've had to do before. So the combination of all of them has really been quite positive. But with the change from PYB to CYB, as I mentioned earlier, and independent taxation, this is asking a lot of Revenue Jersey.
Okay, great. There's still time to get your questions in on slido.com. We've got streams of them coming in at the moment, which is brilliant. But go onto your browser, put in slido.com, and under the hashtag taxexperts, you can ask your question anonymously if you want. So just to go through a few more, because there really are so many here. Why can't a family decide how they wish to be taxed, whether that be independently or jointly as one household, as all finances are shared as one pot? Who wants to answer that? There you go, Fiona.
Yeah, I'll try. Karen is not alone. There are 3 likes there. This is something that we hear quite often from people. Why can't we just, what's wrong with sticking with the current system, or why can't we have something slightly different? As the comptroller set out earlier, Islanders over a number of years in a variety of ways have said that what they want us to do is make the tax system fairer in this respect, and to treat people in similar situations in a more similar way. So with that aim at its heart, if we were to have a system which didn't achieve that, we wouldn't be able to deliver the policy objective and what Islanders have asked us to do, because there would still be inequality and uneven and unfair treatment between people in similar situations, purely based on either their relationship status or their gender or their age. So that's one reason why a family can't decide just to stay being taxed as a household, or in the system we have for married couples now. Another one, which the Minister mentioned earlier, is this move also helps meet a political commitment by the Government of Jersey to further align with a number of international conventions, one of which is the Convention for the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, and the transition to independent taxation will help with meeting that objective. And then the third reason, it is not a good use of taxpayers' money. It'd be a poor use of taxpayers' money if we were to run two systems and have all of the cost associated with that for an indefinite period.
Okay,
so I hope that helps Karen understand why.
Very, very fulsome answer. Okay, so let's get back to those questions on Slido then. Let's have a little look. Why are you stressing people out with these changes so soon after COVID, Brexit and rocketing inflation? Minister, perhaps you could answer that one.
They were in line to come in before COVID. Certainly the independent taxation I've been wanting to do for a very long time. And it followed on from, as you mentioned at the start, social security, which Fiona just described as discrimination against women. So it's been in the running for quite a while. Yeah. The PYB to CYB, prior year basis to current year basis, was accelerated in order that we could bring it in to assist with independent taxation. Yeah. And also the revenue from that would help with the COVID costs.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. And Controller, do you think that this is done to stress people out, or is there much better reasons than that?
Well, I appreciate that we're making an awful lot of changes in the tax system. I think, as the Minister indicated earlier, the domestic tax system, over the last 20 years, we've probably had to spend a lot of time worrying about international tax matters. And our domestic tax is really behind the times. I mean, aspects of our tax law have not really changed since 1928. So it does need to be done. And by doing it in phased approaches and with techniques like grandfathering and phasing the compensatory allowance, we're aiming to do it in a way that doesn't materially disadvantage people and is done gradually. But we all appreciate tax can be very confusing. We do the best we can to make it as simple as possible for people. I do believe in the long run, as a tax administrator, that independent taxation will be a lot simpler for people to manage and understand in the future, and much easier than having to try to form a household income tax return, which I think can present a lot of problems for many people, particularly when they are in that dreadful position that maybe their marriage is breaking up or they're facing a bereavement and that sort of thing, where unravelling the complications of household taxation can be quite overwhelming.
Okay, thank you. So here's a Social Security linked question. I have a red Social Security card and my wife would pay more tax on our pension, particularly if the compensatory allowance goes after 10 years. That's not fair. Is that fair, Minister?
Well, as we've said several times, this says if the allowance goes after 10 years, but of course if the red cards are still around in 10 years, that will be addressed by the review in 7 to 8 years. I don't know if anybody's got anything.
Well, I mean, as I understand the red card system, that they are no longer available. No. I mean, this is the red card, as I understand it, is essentially where a wife receives a pension because of her husband's contributions. Now, again, rather unusually, the tax law says that pension in those circumstances is deemed to belong to the husband.
Yes.
And that can cause a number of complications for a married woman. When the next phase of legislation is introduced, it is quite likely that the Minister and the States Assembly will want to think about whether that particular piece of legislation also ought to change, so that the income a wife receives by virtue of her husband's contributions is deemed in future to belong to the wife in her own right. That would feel more consonant with the principles of independent taxation. So that's certainly an issue we're looking at, but even if that were not to change, as the Minister says, compensatory allowance would kick in.
Okay, thank you. This might be for you, Fiona. How will this affect my frozen 2019 tax liability, where a portion of that liability is applicable to the spouse? Will the husband have to pay over 20 years? I'm hearing quite a lot about this 2019 tax liability that people don't quite understand yet. Can you talk us through that?
Yeah, I'll try to, Malcolm. It is, again, we understand that it can be confusing for people. It's a new change, it's a big change. So the reference here, I think, to the frozen 2019 tax liability is just that. Somebody has moved from the prior year basis to the current year basis, and what the legislation did is it froze the 2019 tax liability. But the law hasn't changed. The law in 2019 tax law, that liability is the liability in a married couple of the husband, say spouse A, or the older civil partner. That hasn't changed. So that liability, although it's frozen, is legally still the liability of the primary taxpayer. And what will happen under independent taxation, it's separate from, like other common liabilities that are shared between couples, we would expect the couple to work out who pays what towards that bill, but legally it is the primary taxpayers. And will the husband have to repay over 20 years? There is legislation, nothing to do with independent taxation. It was brought in earlier this year, and what it does is it's actually a longer period than that. It allows people to pay, some people have paid now, but they don't have to pay for a few years, and then they have up to 17 years to pay, up until, I believe it's 2041, to pay their 2019 tax liability. So in the vast majority of cases, it will be a very small percentage of income that's being paid each year. I hope that answers the question.
And so I'll just come to you in a second, Christoph, but just so what are the benefits of paying that tax liability now rather than leave it until 2041, or are there none? Other than
People don't like the debt.
yeah, some people don't want to have a debt. Is that what you said, Minister? Yeah. So some people just want to clear that debt. So if anything happens to them, there's no claim on their estate.
It's a very personal choice. I think there are so many potentially different situations that some people will find it a lot easier to say, I'm going to wait and I know how much I need to pay, and other people, as the Minister has said, will think, I'm just going to deal with that. I want it paid.
Thank you.
If they're
did you
able
want to add something, Christoph?
Yes, I'll echo what Fiona has said, but I'll add something because we haven't got enough to go by with that question. If that particular couple has already been separately assessed, what we call separately assessed for 2019, the Revenue Jersey would have calculated each portions of tax.
Okay.
And under that regime of separate assessment, it's not independently taxed. You're still taxed as a unit, as a couple, but each part of the couple pay their own portion.
Okay.
So if we've frozen the 19 liability with a portion to the husband and a portion to the wife, then all of a sudden it doesn't end up as a husband's liability. It still carries on under each head.
Excellent. Okay, thank you. So here's an interesting one, because in my previous role I used to speak to people whose finances were struggling. If we have arrears, how will they be treated? Will they be split between us? Who can answer that one?
I can try and give some element of answer. I would say it depends when the arrears stem from. If the arrears stem from a period in law when there wasn't independent taxation, like Fiona has said, it is then the husband's liability.
Okay.
Or partner A in a civil partnership.
Right. Okay. Does anyone have anything to add to that?
Well, I think the obvious point is that once independent taxation is introduced, then every individual person is responsible for their own tax return and their own tax bill. So, you know, one of the things that occasionally happens with the existing system of married people's taxation is that if there is a very acrimonious divorce, sometimes the couple will split, and the spouse, say, normally the husband, will be left with that tax debt.
Okay, thank you. So here's another one. Can you please explain why some newly married, newly arrived, will have the ability to be independently taxed, but others can only elect to do so from 2023. Who can answer that?
Well, that is basically the phasing, and as Christoph explained, we've broken, and Fiona at the outset, we've broken the change into to 3 phases, and that is so that Revenue Jersey can cope with the changes. We can make the computer changes over a long period of time and develop the compensatory allowance. And so that we can prepare the island for it. And where we are starting is I think, fairly logical. We're saying that if you're single now, you will be independently taxed for all time, because single person's taxation is essentially independent taxation. Equally, if you're coming to the island, and most people, or a lot of people come to the island from places like the UK, Portugal and so on, Poland, they will be used to independent taxation. They will want to keep it. Some women and other spouses be, when they arrive in Jersey, are really quite shocked to find that independent taxation is not already available to them. So, you know, that's the logical place to start. And then year 2 is voluntary. And as I say, there are about 14,000 married people who will either be better off or no worse off. So we expect quite a lot of them to move into independent taxation in that phase 2 in 2023. And then after that will be the mandatory phase. Now, I would expect people who are likely to be needing the compensatory allowance to wait for that mandatory phase, because that's the thing we need to program into our systems. That's what will take a little longer.
Perfect. Okay, thank you. Here's somebody that's looking to the future. What is the next big tax change we can expect after independent taxation? Minister, is that one for you? How to be popular?
No, I think, as we've mentioned before, the move from PYB to CYB and then independent taxation, which, as we've all said, is phased. Mm-hmm. It's going to take a huge amount of work to get to that stage. So there's nothing big on the programme at the moment.
No, I think it's fair to say there are quite a lot of big changes that are going to take the next 2 or 3 years to deliver in the phased way we've described. So I think other big changes to the tax system, and there's quite a lot that could be modernised over a 10 to 15 year period. We'll be much further down the path.
Okay, thank you. So we're drawing to the close now. What I would say is, if you've put your question onto slido.com and you've not had it answered, over the next couple of days the team will attempt to answer those questions for you back through the app. So do check back on the next day or two, and if you've not had your question answered, we will endeavour to make sure that question gets to you. So perhaps if I can just go back to the panel for some closing remarks about what you've heard tonight, the generality of the question, and you know what we're trying to create here, and just some closing comments. Susie, from you.
Well, as we've all said, it is complicated. There's no doubt about it. This is why we did such a lot of consultation, as Richard said, 5,000 people, which is unheard of in Jersey, to respond to focus groups and consultation. And I think, as Fiona said, that all the leaflets and the briefings at the parish halls, and this evening, for instance, is very helpful in trying to explain what is a complicated system. Yeah. And people have got lots of questions pertinent to their own situation normally, but we'll get there, and it will then be, as we said at the beginning, equitable, modern, and tie us in with the rest of the world, really, after a nearly 100-year law.
Yeah, okay, thank you. And Richard, some closing comments from you.
Well, I think I would take the opportunity to thank Highlanders for bearing with us, because our customer service has, over the last 2 years, not been where we would wish it to be. Our people have been working very hard indeed, and they are all deeply committed to helping the Minister to deliver these important changes. As I said earlier, as a tax administrator, I do believe they will, in the longer run, be much easier to run, much easier for taxpayers to understand, and much more efficient for taxpayers generally in terms of the costs of running the Jersey tax system.
Okay, thank you. And Fiona?
Yeah, I think it's just to hopefully remind and reiterate for islanders that we are listening. We do take seriously the concerns and the fears that people have about this change. It is a big change. We are trying to help islanders help themselves with things like the tax calculator. So if you are able to have a look, I'd urge islanders to do that. And we will be doing more engagement in various forms as we go forward with this, particularly around the detail of the compensatory allowance when we're able to.
Okay, thank you. And Christoph?
I wanted to thank all islanders for the interest that they're giving to the topic as well. I'd go back to what Fiona said about the tax calculator. I would really advise people to play with it. There's nothing to be broken there. You can play with it, you can change the amount of income, you can change the amount of relief, you can see what the difference is. And I might add, it is not an independent tax calculator, it's just a tax calculator. It shows you how tax works. So it's not just for independent taxation.
No, perfect. Okay. Do you know, I've learned so much tonight, just in this 1 hour, in this conversation, and I've just taken a couple of notes, and the three things that kind of stick their heads up for me are the compensatory allowance. I think people really need to understand how that works in their favour. The tax calculator sounds like a great resource for people to get to understand what's going to be the best option for them when the time comes. And equality was something that we spoke right at the top of this. So, you know, for me, it sounds like what I'm hearing, this is as much about equality as it is about bringing our system up to, you know, what would be a modern fit-for-purpose taxation system. So if you put your question onto Slido, please do be assured that we will get back to the top 10 in the next couple of days. What I'd like to do is wrap this up by firstly thanking the panel who've answered all the questions that we put before them without any fault. I would like to thank you, the public, for bringing your questions to us. It's really important that, you know, government is open and honest about what it's trying to achieve, and this is a great way for the public to interact in a live situation. And of course, this will be on YouTube ad infinitum, so it'll always be there as a resource, and you can see exactly how those questions were answered. And lastly, I'd like to thank the team that are behind the cameras tonight, doing all the hard work. They have been faultless as well, as far as I can see. So this isn't the end of the conversation. There's lots more to come. As you've seen, there's been lots of ways that the government is trying to reach out to people to inform them of these changes and give them the best solutions that they can for their own personal situation. So keep that conversation going. But from me and here in the studio, have a good evening and good night.